Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Real Science Exchange, the pubcast where leading scientists and industry professionals meet over a few drinks to discuss the latest ideas and trends in dairy nutrition. My name's Scott Sorrell. I'm going to be your host tonight, and I've got a new co-host this evening. I've invited Dr. Jim Tully from California to join me as my co-host. Jim, how are you doing today? And welcome to the Real Science Exchange. This is your first time here.
Yep. I appreciated the invite. I'm honored. I've known Philip, who we'll get to in a minute, for 30 years. Kevin, a lot fewer than that, but have learned actually quite a bit from both of those gentlemen. So I was very honored when you asked me to sit in and co-host.
You're very welcome. I'm excited to have you here. I don't know if you remember, but you and I met, it's got to be in the early 2000s. Mm-hmm. I was working with back then it was called Virtus, and we had Nutrius, and so that's when you and I first met. So I was excited to have you on as well. Jim, you have anything special in your glass tonight?
This time of day it would have to be beer. Okay.
Yep.
And I live in Minnesota, but do work out west. In fact, just got back from California last evening, where it was sunny and 70 for 3 days. So then I thought, well, since I'm home, I probably should start with a Sam Adams cold snap.
Yeah.
Either getting cold or hopefully the cold snaps out of it. So that's what I'm going to enjoy for the afternoon.
Yeah, excellent. So our guest that we have this evening is Dr. Kevin Dhuyvetter. Kevin did a webinar for us back on March 5th, and it was titled Dairy Economics, Factors Affecting Profitability. Gave that back on March 5th. If you've not listened to that webinar, you need to go back and listen to it. You just go to balchem.com/real science. There is a lot of meaty information there. And if you're a nutritionist, forward it to your dairy farmers. They're going to want to hear this. Now, I will say this is not an easy listening webinar, Dr. Dhuyvetter. You're going to want to pour, a double or maybe a triple to get through this one, because you're going to find yourself pausing and backing up a lot, as I've done in preparation for the podcast. But a lot of great information, and looking forward to the discussion this evening. Now, Dr. Dhuyvetter, welcome. Your first time to the Real Science Exchange as well. Anything interesting in your glass tonight?
Well, I am enjoying a bourbon barrel aged stout. Normally, the way the weather was a week ago, I'd say I wouldn't have been drinking a stout, but we're looking at snow here today, and this is good. And it's a Western Michigan beer, Dragon's Milk, so it's kind of a dairy product, but not really. So that's what I'm enjoying tonight. Pleasure to be here too.
So dragons must be mammals if they have milk, I guess.
Yep. You don't want to milk them. Do they fit into a rotary parlor? Anyway, so your guest has spoken up here, Dr. Dhuyvetter. Would you mind introducing him?
Yeah, just real quick. So my guest is Dr. Philip Jardon, and Philip and I worked together at Lanco for 10 years. Just thoroughly enjoyed working with him. We've had a lot of interesting discussions over the years about economics and just all kinds of things. Recently, he moved back to Iowa, and he's now at Iowa State. And as much as we absolutely hated to see him leave Lanco, I have to believe he's really benefiting the people of Iowa, because one thing about Dr. Jardon is he absolutely loves to teach people, and it's great. So I'm sure the people of Iowa are very welcoming to him.
Well, thank you for joining us, Phil.
Thank you.
Anything special in your glass tonight?
Well, I'm having a Fairlife chocolate milk in my Real Science mug. But I want to say a few things here about something I'd really like to be drinking, but it's a little bit too early to start with this wheyskey. I think it's pretty exciting that people are finding new ways to use dairy products, and one of them is whey, which is we consider a waste product. And there's several distilleries around the country now making whey. This one's coming from California. This is from Wheyward Distillery in California, and it's called wheyskey, not whiskey, because whiskey can't be made from whey. It has to be made from grains. So it's a wheyskey, not a whiskey.
Yeah, excellent. Now I understand that one of the professors at the university there is going to be giving a webinar. Would you mind telling us about that and how the audience can access that webinar?
Sure can. It's actually not a professor from our school. He's actually someone that's doing this in practice up in Wisconsin. His name is Curtis Basina from Copper Crow Distillery in Bayfield, Wisconsin. And it's going to be Wednesday, May 15th from noon to 1, but it will also be recorded if you can't make it at that time. But you can go to goiastate.edu /Whey and sign up for it. And I think you're going to put a note in the show notes about it too, a link to it.
Exactly. We'll put a link there in the show notes for everyone.
Yep. I just think it's pretty cool that we're finding another use for whey.
No, absolutely. Yes. Hope it helps milk prices as well. Anyway, but thank you for joining us tonight. Looking forward to great discussions. Myself, I'm having what I call my forever bourbon. I usually do this when I run out of bourbon. And what I do, I've got this very nice decanter that's shaped like a globe. And every time I get to maybe the last quarter of a bottle, I'll pour it in there. So it's always a little different and continues to change. And so, yes, I'm low on bourbon. And so I am getting my forever bourbon. And with that, what I'd like to do is, toast the dairy industry, right? What a bunch of great people. And, I've been privileged to have a long career in the dairy industry, and I really do appreciate it. So here's to the dairy industry. Cheers.
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 New research is changing everything we thought we knew about choline's impact on the cow and her calf, and top scientists have a lot to say about it. They are presenting new research that supports choline as a required nutrient to optimize milk production, choline as a required nutrient to support a healthy transition, choline as a required nutrient to improve calf health and growth, and choline as a required nutrient to increase colostrum quantity. This new research is solidifying choline's role as a required nutrient for essentially every cow, regardless of health status, milk production level, or body condition score. Learn more about the science that is changing the game and the choline source that is making it happen. Reassure precision-release choline from Balchem. Visit balchem.com/scientistsay to learn more.
With that, Dr. Dhuyvetter, let's jump right into it. As I've already stated, that was an amazing webinar, and I do once again encourage everyone to go back and listen to that. Actually watch it, because you've got a lot of great charts and graphs in there. But kind of give us a couple kind of key takeaways or key learnings or key themes that you talked about during that presentation.
Sure. So the majority of the presentation was talking about factors impacting profitability, and I looked at data from a lot of places, and a couple key drive home, consistent points, I would argue, across data points, across time and whatnot, were that those people that tend to be more profitable, they tend to be larger. Now, some people hear that and hear it the wrong way. It doesn't mean we're necessarily all advocating that everybody has to be really large dairy. But the reality is there's a lot of fixed costs in dairying, and those people that have grown their operations tend to be the ones that are surviving. But more importantly, is diluting your costs by having high production per cow. So the successful operations tend to dilute costs by being a little bit larger than average and also more productive than average. Now, just got to always remind people, we're talking averages, and there are exceptions to every rule, right? So sometimes people hear that message and they say, well, I know someone that's doing something else. And these are some pretty broad statements. But so that's the key message is that, you need to strive to always get better. The average over time is a moving target, right? Dairies go out of business, and that means there's more consolidation. So you always should strive for improvement. And I think everybody already knows that. But constant striving to improve is pretty critical in the dairy industry as well as many industries.
One of the things that I kind of had trouble getting my mind around is zero profits. You're saying that, it's a very competitive industry, and help me get my mind around that and talk about that for the audience.
Yeah.
What do you mean by that?
That's a good point. And it's one we get pushback on a lot. But if you remember, I kind of threw in a number of weasel words. I said profits are equal to zero on average in a competitive industry in the long run. So we know that some people are consistently better than average. But the more important thing to recognize is when we say average profits are zero, we're actually including all economic costs. And when I say all economic costs, that recognizes that all assets, and assets can either be my skills or my capital, right? I own land, I own facilities, but I also have time. We're putting a charge on everything. So some people will say, well, I've been making money all the time, but in all honesty, they've maybe been making a lower rate of return on their land or their facilities or to their labor than what we would assign them as an economist. So remember, when we say economic profits, we're charging for everything, and we're charging what we think are opportunity costs of whatever that could have earned somewhere else. So that, and that's what a lot of people don't really factor that part in.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, okay, let's say we accept zero is okay. Now, many of the last few years, though, you've got a slide in your presentation that shows that we've been less than zero. So can you talk a little bit about that and how we're going to get out of that?
We're probably not going to get out of it. Now, I got to be careful now because some people will hear it the wrong way again. So once again, even though we've been below zero on average, we know even in the last few years, I suspect there have been people that are making money, right? So once again, we always have to remember averages. And we have been on average losing dairy producers year over year consistently for 50 plus years, right? And the point I made in the webinar is that for the most part, people don't go out of business, I don't believe, if they're making money. They go out of business at some point because the next generation doesn't want to come back because they don't feel this is an attractive place to be employed. So they go somewhere else. And so the fact that we consistently see fewer and fewer farms from year to year kind of reinforces that average person is not making money. That doesn't mean that there's not people individually making money. There's people that are doing very, very well, and they'll be around. It's a moving target, right? So what was better than average last year, 10 years, might be below average. So those are concepts, and once again, I keep hitting on this. It's on average because some people use it and they take it personally, and it's not intended to be that way.
And maybe to help me, because I deal with the producer side, is it the idea that the industry is an average of break even, or is it even the individual operations are break even? And if it's the operations, is it more important what they do with their profits when they make them to keep them above average?
It's a good question.
So yeah, they're all going to be good questions, and we just got to hope that once in a while we can come up with a good answer. If I'm a successful dairy producer, so let's say that routinely, because of my management, because of how I've got my cost structured, whatever it is, I'm realizing a 15 to 20% rate of return. If I make profit, what should I do with that profit? Mm-hmm. Well, I could invest it in the stock market. I could invest it in a Subway sandwich shop, or why not invest it back in myself and grow my operation? If I can get that kind of rate of return, maybe my best alternative use for that profit is back in me, in my company. And that's what we've seen a lot of, right? As we've seen a lot of consolidation and people growing their businesses, that's usually a pretty good sign. Not always, usually a pretty good sign that that's a very successful operation, and they grow because they were exactly making profits. When we see some of those individual operations that for the last 20, 30 years have not grown, hopefully if they were profitable, they better be able to show that there's some other assets out there that they've been investing in. And if they can't really show us that tells you they're really not profitable. They're just kind of breaking even because they're not able to grow their business or invest money, profits outside their business.
Okay.
So Phil, I'm going to throw this to you. In your experience, as you look at that, at the farmers that are profitable and ones that are less successful, how would you characterize those differences?
The successful ones emphasize efficiency and making sure they dilute out their maintenance cost really well, um, and then have everything going really well fine tuned. Right, the feed's always pushed up. You just always see the bunks full of feed. Even the stalls full of bedding, and then the time budget of the cows. Just they are usually spot on. It's they're just very efficient places.
A client I won't mention, but in California years ago, he was kind of a co-manager of two operations, and this fits how you described it. One always exceeded the other. Same ownership. I was doing diets, so diets would be similar. So I asked the manager, I said, what's the difference at this point? It was between 85 pounds of milk and 90 pounds of milk. And his answer was so simple and clear. He said, to get 90 pounds of milk, that'd be 100 a day or whatever. He said, everything matters. And that kind of separates those herds that do okay versus the ones we all hear about that are 100 pounds of milk, or, a 70-pound Jersey herd. It's everything matters. You can't be tolerant of stuff, I think, is how I interpret it.
Oh, I think that's right. But I also think looking at the right economic indicators too. So, like Kevin brought up in his talk, if you concentrate totally on saving money, you don't do very well.
Yep.
But if you look at return on how much it costs to make a unit of milk, or income over feed cost, that's what really matters.
Yep.
And I think my clients that have done a good job doing that have been more successful than those that don't.
Yep.
So a couple things I'd like to just interject there, Scott, real quick is I've worked with different benchmarking groups with a lot of different industries, dairy, custom harvesters, and whatnot. And everybody always would love to know what's that one silver bullet for what do I just need to do to be profitable. Yep. And what we just heard from Philip and Jim is exactly right. It's all the little things done right and done consistently that often are the one thing that makes the difference. And that's not an easy answer, right? Just says you got to do things right every day. And that really comes down to management. And
yes.
So that's a big issue. Now, the one other thing I wanted to point out, because when you first started this question, you mentioned the word, and you probably rephrasing something I said. So I want to correct myself. I don't want us to say you have to be profitable and make a lot of money to be successful. That is a very subjective decision, right? Okay. There are people today that know that they could probably be making more money if they took a job in town, if they sold their farm equipment and invested in something else, but they're doing something they really love doing. They're putting food on the table. So I don't ever want to have people realize or think that the only way we can measure success is by a balance sheet, because there's a lot of other things that are very important as well.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I agree. 100% makes total sense. It's kind of a concept I apply to my life, right? It's, a successful life isn't one where you make a lot of money. It's where you're a good husband, a good father, a good, community member. All those things are very important. So yeah, you're singing from the same songbook. So appreciate that. A couple things that I pulled from the webinar that you talked about, and you said it today, the income over feed cost. There's always pressure to reduce feed costs, but yet you found that on average, low feed costs is not an indicator of higher profits. Can you talk a little bit about that? And I'm sure it goes back to, diluting your fixed costs, but maybe talk a little bit about the numbers that you came up with, maybe how you came up with those numbers, maybe the research project that you used.
Yeah, like I said, it's always tough because as economists, we always get accused of saying, well, you assume this, you assume that. But the reality is we have to make some assumptions on some things. And if I lower my feed costs, now I'm going to make some broad statements and we can come back to them if we need to. Mm-hmm. If I lower my feed costs and production is negatively impacted, likely that was not the right thing to do. Obviously, if you can lower your feed costs with no negative impact on production, that's a great thing, right? If I can lower my feed costs and still maintain the same level of income, you'll win. But what I find is you view people in operations over time that try to start saving money, production is hurt. And then it's a spiral down. But once again, that's not the case all the time. I'm currently, this actually was the result of the webinar, is I had someone reach out to me and say, can you help me think through doing some of this pen move type analysis? And there definitely are times when lower feed costs doesn't necessarily hurt you, because the cost savings might be bigger. Well, they could be bigger than the reduction in income. I guess the main point is, don't automatically assume that lowering feed costs is always a good thing. Don't necessarily assume it's a bad thing, right? It's very case by case, depends on what stage of lactation. It depends on a lot of things.
When I've dealt with feed costs now for 20 some years, and I'm a little slow on the uptake, but in the past 5 years, it really clicked. All feeds are, we're not buying feeds, we're buying nutrients. Mm-hmm. And, well, this substitute, well, it's $50 a ton cheaper. Okay. Well, there's probably a reason why it's $50 a ton cheaper. The market knows what nutrient costs should be. And I found if somebody's got a spot where I need to cut costs for just for 3 months, usually we can get by and cows will do fine. But there's herds that have cut costs, and now they're a year into it, and we can't turn that switch back on to get the production back in a matter of days. It's going to be months and stuff. So that's how I view it. Does that make sense? I mean, Phil, you dealt with it in California as well.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. It's hard to turn the switch back on, but it's hard as a consultant though to come up sometimes and know which products to add and which ones to take out. Mm-hmm. It's up to looking at the science behind the products and our experiences with them to help make those decisions on those.
Yep.
Mm-hmm. Kevin, so it's kind of on the same topic here. I have some clients that really like to raise their own feeds. And when I tell them that you said that's a bad thing to do, they're going to be mad at me. So can you clarify that a little bit? Because I don't think you necessarily mean that it's a bad thing to raise your own feed. But
absolutely not. I mean, I think even in the webinar, I probably shared that I'm using this one slide a little bit because it met my bias, and my bias was not, and it isn't to say that home raised feeds is a bad thing. That's not what I was wanting to get the point across. The point I want to get across is, don't automatically assume because you raised your own feed somehow that's a lower cost. Most likely, in many cases, people think that way because they haven't put all the opportunity costs on what it costs them to produce that grain or that silage or that hay, because, well, the land was already paid for. Well, once again, if we factor in opportunity costs, that land could be used for something else. You could rent it out to somebody else. You could produce a cash crop. So you really need to put the cost of that land at what it could be used for. And when you do all that, the cost of home raised feed probably is not that much different. So I'm not here to say that having a lot of home raised feed is a bad thing, and I'm not here to say it's necessarily a good thing. Now, if I can produce nutrients, back to Jim's point, if I can produce nutrients more effectively and more cost efficiently on my own land, by all means, home raised feed is going to be a very good thing to do. Because at the end of the day, it's those nutrients that matter. But if I produce low quality feed on my own farm, I might be better off going out and buying it from somewhere else.
Phil, that was something that kind of caught me as well, and I've kind of been thinking on a couple ideas I came up with. Is it's easier to buy good feed perhaps than it is to raise good feed. Maybe that's one way to look at it. And then I'm wondering also, is there an element in there where where it may be taking focus off of good dairying if you're focusing on raising good crops, and is it hard to do both, right? Just kind of curious your thoughts on that.
Well, as a veterinarian, when I first started practicing, we used to call it corn planting disease and corn picking disease.
Yeah.
there'd be problems on the dairies at those times of year because the concentration was on those feeds. But it makes a lot of sense to put it on those feeds, and I think because it's especially corn silage, it's your one time of the year to get up most of the feed you're going to feed that year. Most of the people we work with, even in California and here in the Midwest, I mean, corn silage is king, and it is a really good feed, and it really is worth putting some effort into making sure it gets done well. So I'm not going to argue with anybody that's put some effort into it.
I view that as one of Dr. Dhuyvetter's points early on. The larger operations can have a farm crew and can have a herdsman or a herd health crew that don't have to jump in a pack tractor, that don't have to get in the silage trucks. You take care of the cows. Don't worry about the farming side, and that's operation dependent.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point, Jim. That's just another potential advantage of a larger operation, right? They have a core group of employees that can specialize. Yep. And unfortunately, and like I said, this is not intended to sit and talk about large versus small, but the smaller operations, you're doing it all kind of by necessity. You're planting the corn, you're taking care of the cattle, you're freshening cows, so it's that larger operation has allowed labor specialization, if you want. Mm-hmm. And that's one of the reasons why I think they tend to be more productive. I did have a dairyman tell me one year, and this was quite a few years back, it was a fairly decent sized dairy, but they were growing. And the manager told me, he said, we own a bunch of our land here around the dairy, but we've made a conscious decision to go ahead and just rent it out to some local farmers, and then we'll buy it back.
Yep.
But we're not necessarily good farmers. We think we're pretty good dairymen, and I know they are. And his comment was, we need to specialize in what we're good at. Now, they even had their own land, but they actually rented it out to somebody and then turned around and bought the grain back from them or the silage back from them. There's a lot of dairymen in the U.S. that would probably say that's you just don't. Why would you do that? But they were recognizing their strength and saying our weakness is we'll get someone else to help us out with.
A lot of people made that decision on growing their calves, right? They send their calves off to a calf ranch because is that what you're going to say, Jim?
No, I was going to get at the custom harvesting people, but similar concept. Do what you do best.
Yep.
Yeah, great point. Yeah. Kind of taking a little different track here. I'm kind of curious. Saw the data and all the discussion's been around the U.S. dairies. Have you done any comparison with the U.S. dairy economics versus other geographic regions around the world?
I have not. The one thing that we'll see once in a while is when you see some of the statistics out there, they talk about how the U.S. Dairy industry can probably produce milk as cheap or as low cost as most places. The one place that, at least in the data I've seen from time to time, that always has an advantage over us is places like New Zealand.
Right.
Because they have a very
about that one.
Way less capital intensive. But when I did see the one analysis and I started digging into it and asking questions, they were putting a minimal or no charge on land. Well, of course, if you take your biggest asset or your biggest expense and you don't charge for it, you're going to look pretty good, right? Yeah. So I think we need to make sure that we're talking apples to apples when we make some of these comparisons. But the little bit of data I have seen is U.S. dairy is competitive with most places.
Kind of another tangent I was going to take is as you look at economics, right? There used to be that we were getting paid, I think, more for the protein in the milk, and now it's much more for the fat. And I'm kind of curious if you've got any, have you taken a look at that from an economist perspective?
I haven't. One thing I said the day I started working for Lanco is if you guys want me to understand the milk market, go find someone else because I don't have that many years of my career left. But if you look at what the long-term trends, and not even just the long-term, even the last 5 to 10 years for sure, if you look at what's happened with components in the U.S., the nice thing about when all of a sudden things are tied more to fat the nutritionists, the kind of work that Jim's doing, and they respond, right? Mm-hmm. Whereas with protein, there's a little less things we can do. Genetically, we can still work there, but management-wise, I think we've got so much more opportunity. 10 years ago, would you have ever thought of hearing a Holstein herd averaging 100 pounds of milk at 4.25% fat?
No.
Mm-mm. I'm not saying that's the typical today, but we sure hear of those, right?
You hear, yes, that herd exists.
That's a genetic thing, but it's also a lot of management. So the good thing from a producer standpoint is, as that's become more important for my prices, there's more things within my control and my consultants that are helping me that we can now help and manage and economically take advantage of. So from that standpoint, I think it's been good. And the market has clearly shown that they have responded. If you just look at the trends in butterfat in the U.S.
Yeah, without a doubt. The other thought I had relative to that, and this might be off the wall, but, fat's got far more calories in it than does protein. And so it's got to be more expensive to make that butter fat, right? And so I'm just kind of curious, what role is all that playing in feed costs and economics? And I don't even know if, Jim, is that even a consideration, or have you looked at that from a practical perspective on your dairies?
Yeah, we do. And actually, I'd say it's pretty regular. And even if, milk fat wasn't as valuable as it is, the past few years with butter consumption, making milk is an energy function. It really, outside of water, I believe it's probably the most limiting factor on most operations, whether it's an intake problem, pushing up feed, like Philip said, it's energy drives the system, and we definitely pay attention to that. And on the feed costs, I don't want to say we ignore the cost of that energy, but if a herd wants to be 100 pounds of milk and a 4.2 fat test and a 3.3 protein or whatever the number is, it's going to be hard to do that on an inexpensive basis. It's hard to get that done today. Yeah. And that involves feeding some of those fats that are probably a little expensive to get in front of the cow. Yep.
Yeah. But this is that classic place where maybe you have to spend money to make money.
Yep.
Like I said, but it's always a fine line. That's why people hire the gyms of the world to help them make that decision, because there's some point where it quits paying for sure, right?
Yes.
But but there might be a place where I could spend more money, get a higher fat, and that is definitely a profitable thing to do. But you can't keep doing it forever. It's going to start tailing off. So, once again, why we have to make this decision case by case.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. It might be an unfair question. We're going to ask you guys to kind of look into your crystal ball. And do we see this changing? Is there always going to be an emphasis on fat for the next 10 years? Is this the new normal with milk protein being lower? I think it's almost all-time lows now, at least since I can remember. Is this something we can expect going forward?
I don't know. I think maybe it'll swing back and forth occasionally. If you look at the protein markets, it's been up and down. It's down now, but it has been just a few years ago. It was fairly high.
Yep.
And I'm hoping that things like this wheyskey find new ways to make whey more valuable from the sugar that's in it. Maybe it'll help get the whey proteins out there and more people using them in other ways too. So, if
you say 10 years, okay, that's almost like saying an always in this market. Nevers and always just really don't fit. And I'd say in the next 10 years, I'll bet you protein gets more valuable to own than fat. Just the cycles.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would concur. Is that I think sometimes we all have a tendency to have this, what did I see recently? And we this recency effect.
Yes.
This is the way it's going to be. It's like the markets almost always come back and remind us that no, we adjust and we change over time. So I think we'll see things swing in both directions going forward. I just can't predict when. If I could, that would help.
Kevin, could you go back to, sorry, Scott, that in the webinar, as well as some other conversations that we've had, kind of go over that the value of culling, or the impact of culling, and those, sending a cow to market, or what's her what should be considered when we go to replace her, those kinds of economic decisions.
So we got another 3 hours on this webinar. I mean, you know that's a loaded question, because it's art, right? And there's so many parts that come into play. And I'm going to take a step back and compare it to something that I think is a little bit similar. Is when I was at Kansas State, we used to get people would ask us questions. This was not dairy related at all. We get people asking us questions about leverage on your farm, and they'd say, "Well, how much debt should I have, and is that a good thing or bad thing?" And when we go back and observe data, 10 to 20 years of data from farms, because we had a really good database at Kansas State for crop farms, what we found was leverage oftentimes was a good thing or a bad thing. Okay. And by that, I mean, the people that could get that 15 to 20% rate of return on their money because they were a good farmer, the best thing they could do is go borrow money if they could borrow it for 4, 5, 6%. Unfortunately, a little bit higher today, because they were leveraging it, right? On the other hand, someone that could get a 4% rate of return on their money and was paying the bank 6%, they were going backwards on every dollar they borrowed. And what would happen is they just fall further and further behind. So when you observed them after the fact, you saw that those people that were the least economically successful had high debt. Okay. Those that were the most economically successful had high debt. Okay. I think culling is the same thing. I think we will go back and we'll see herds that have tremendously successful operations that have very low cull rates because they have very healthy cows. They're really well managed. They do all the little things right. They go ahead and they start breeding with more sex semen, more beef semen. They produce enough heifers because they don't need to replace. On the other hand, we're going to see people that have very low cull rates because they have a hard time producing heifers, getting them pregnant, keeping them alive. So at the end of the day, they keep cows longer than they should. Okay. So we'll see the same thing. We'll see people with low cull rates that are unsuccessful and very successful. Kind of the same concept as that leverage. One is because they're doing it proactively and they're good, and the other one's because they have to. Okay. So when people always say, what's the right cull rate? What's the optimal replacement rate? It's a loaded question because it depends on so many things. You know what I mean? That's a terrible answer, but it's the reality.
No, I appreciate the way you took that. And I think it's also a matter of it's each operation and then each culling decision are very individualized. Is that how you mean it?
Oh, very much so. Very much so. Yes. I mean, I would never want to go on to a dairy and have them say, well, what's the cull rate I should have? Now, if they tell me that we are doing a really good job with all the little things, we have healthy cows, we can get cows pregnant on timely fashion, and they're doing everything right, I'm going to say you should shoot for 30% or less. I think that's, if it's attainable, that's probably your best thing to be. That would be the absolute worst thing for me to tell somebody that is struggling and they keep a bunch of cows that are way past their prime, but they can't sell them because they don't have a replacement to come in their place. So once again, it's a very individualized decision. If everybody wants that silver bullet, what's the right answer? And the right answer is a lot more complicated,
Okay.
obviously.
There are some interesting tools in some of the software. Like PC Dart has a thing called Keeper Beef, and Dairy Comp has CalVal, which I think both those tools are kind of underutilized and not used enough in helping make decisions. Because it's looking at the slot for that cow and whether it makes sense for her to be there or whether it's better to have a replacement for her, rather than just the whole overall number. It's looking at each one individually.
What are the factors that go into making that decision in those programs?
Well, that's way above my pay grade on that
Okay.
question. But the big things are the milk production of that cow and whether she's pregnant or not. Those are two of the big things that make it. And how old she is, how likely she is to be around, whether she gets cold or not. So just naturally, there's lots of factors that go in on both of those. But and then the computer calculates essentially a value for that cow based on those upon that information.
I'm not familiar with the keeper beef one, but the cow val, let's recognize when this was developed, right? It was developed a long time ago. And at that time, initially nobody thought about components. So now they have tried to make some adjustments to account for components because that's very relevant, right? Not just milk flow, but energy corrected milk. But the other thing that no one would have thought about 20 years ago is she carrying a beef calf or a dairy calf? And that might be very relevant today, right? So I think these are great tools, and I think they could be utilized more than they are. They're not perfect, but for a lot of people going forward, at least some is better than nothing. So yeah, I think there's some tools out there, but they still could be improved a little bit, probably.
Kevin, do I understand it correctly that part of your job is you'll go onto dairies and you'll evaluate them and consult with dairies in helping them prove their economics?
Yes and no. Philip, why are you smiling? Yes, for sure. But sometimes it's not in the same way as you think, because it's very seldom really looking at a lot of financial and economic information. It's usually geared very much around production. But as I've said, and I think there's a lot of data that backs it up, high producing, efficient animals, not just necessarily the highest producing, but they got to be efficient. That usually ties in very close with economics. So a lot of the work I do looks at things that are driving milk production, repro, and removals. I mean, those are the three big drivers of economics, right? So yeah, I do that. Now, I have a limited amount of time, so I'm not going to lie that good customers get first dibs on me, because I can't be going everywhere and anywhere. But yeah, that is what I do, and it's what I love to do.
Okay.
And I've seen some of those, and I'm glad you brought it up, Scott, because I didn't know if we wanted to go down that path. But one of the things I've seen on a few operations has been, if I could pick a day to get an animal pregnant, what is that day? And Kevin has done that, and I'd like to hear it again. It might be my third time hearing it, so that it might sink in. What's been the value of that, Kevin, for herds you've talked to?
Well, one, I don't know for sure what they ever do with my information, but sometimes it's just confirming what they were thinking, or it's giving them an excuse not to make a change. But so the way this first came up, and it was working out in California with Philip, and it was a question that's coming up every place in the country right now. A dairy said, look, our production has been very good. Everybody's production has been going up. Their repro has significantly improved from 10, 15 years ago. So the question came to me is, maybe we should be trying to get our cows pregnant later, because we're drying off cows at a lot of milk. And it makes sense that we should just not even start trying as early. And that's how the question came to me, and I analyzed it. And my conclusion has been, and this has been fairly robust across Holstein herds, that those second and greater lactation cows, I come back and I say, no, get her pregnant as fast as you can and get her back to her next peak. And as I've been looking at data from different herds, pretty routine, I'm noticing in the data that of the herds I'm looking at, they're increasing their voluntary wait period. So I think the industry has been going to where they're saying, we're not going to try to get our cows pregnant as fast. Yeah. I'm suggesting that's maybe not the right thing to do, based on, an analysis of about 12 different herds. So it's not, I haven't done this all over the country, but the results on the Holstein herds were pretty consistent. Jim's familiar with the ones on some Jersey herds, and they were a little more mixed. Mm-hmm. But it's still generally the conclusion is that, for the most part, we probably don't want to delay too long.
That's mostly because of a lot of it's because of the persistency, right?
Oh, exactly. And that's why the first lactation would be a little different potentially. Yes.
Yeah.
And it's taken a little bit. It's been very helpful. The herds that I've been involved with that you did it on. One of the challenges to me has been to split that. There's nothing wrong with a 90 or 100-day voluntary waiting period on the first lactation animals. And maybe it should be 65, right? Yeah. On the mature cows or whatever number they feel comfortable with. And I'm like, well, I think it's just codes in dairy comp or whatever it is. And like, why can't you do that?
So that is one thing that I can come into a dairy and say, here's my results. That now you have to maybe implement if you're going to make change, because that's always a pushback a little bit is, okay, it's easy to say, but now we've got to manage changing cow flow. And that I'm not minimizing it, but once you get to some kind of new static system where it's 90 on these, 60 on these, I think that could work.
Yes.
But in the short term, it's going to disrupt your cow flow a bit.
Yeah. But it seems like it's worth doing it. Some have done it, but very often we do have resistance. I don't know of anybody who split them and has gone back. So I perhaps they like it.
So I think one good thing that information's done for some producers is to get them off the idea that they really need to back it up and breed those cows at 100 or 120 days. Mm-hmm. I think that's probably been a mistake, and I think Kevin did a good job of helping keep that from happening.
Yeah.
Good stuff. Kevin, are there any key trains of thoughts here that we've not covered yet that we need to cover?
Well, there is actually something that's kind of related a little bit to, I guess, the decision on culling that I just literally had a email pop in here a little bit ago that I saw on my computer. Someone asked me about finding the optimal age to calf that first lactation animal. Mm-hmm. And I think we've all been to conferences and we've heard different talks on this. And unfortunately, the answer is the same as it was with culling, is you cannot have a blanket statement. Okay. Because I routinely look at that when I analyze data. And I can look at one herd and I'll say from a milk standpoint, I tend to focus on milk, but obviously repro and removals is relevant. But from a milk standpoint, I can work on one dairy today and say, you should be calving in your first lactation animals at 25 months. The very next herd, I might say 22 and a half. It all depends on how they raise their heifers.
Yeah.
Right. And I mean, we hear people talk about it all the time. That's why the point of this isn't that there's a right number. There is probably a right number for your operation, but don't think just because my neighbors or my friends are at 23 months, that's where I should be, because it depends on how you raise your heifers compared to them. So same thing as culling is there's not one answer for everybody.
Is there maybe more an appropriate weight?
Well, I think that's exactly, and I mean, the guys, Jim and Philip can speak to that way better than I can. Unfortunately, most people can measure and quantify age because they know when that animal was born. Yeah. They can't do so well on weight because they're not all weighing them as well.
Mm-hmm. Let me follow up with a question then to Philip on that thing. You probably dealt with it. I'm almost positive you dealt with it, Philip, in California with this calf program. I'm going to get accelerated gains or optimum gains, whatever term you want to talk about. They're going to 1.9, pounds before weaning and stuff. And that's good if that works. Yep. But then in California, very often my observation was, yeah, you got to do that. Okay, now she's bred. Make the diet cheap. Mm-hmm. And we gave up all the value. We still have the gain, but we gave up all the value. And now we do calver probably undersized, maybe heavy, maybe over-conditioned, but pretty small because she's pregnant. Just make it cheap. Did you see that some, Philip?
I did see that some, and it's sometimes hard to fight. So we as nutritionists have to give pushback on that. That we need to go spend a little money on protein. If we just feed them, in California, there's this little bit of misconception that the byproducts are really cheap, which they are. But a lot of the byproducts that we feed the growing heifers are really fairly high in energy and not that high in protein.
Yep.
They're not quite good enough for milk cows, but they're really almost too good for growing calves on the energy side. And then we end up shorting those growing animals on protein.
Yep.
And sometimes just going to spend a little money, like what Kevin's talking here, this whole economics thing, spend a little money on protein. I'll get those animals bigger and a little bit stronger, and they'll calve in better. But you're right. When people want to have $1 per day, what it costs to raise a calf, it's hard to go spend the money on that extra ingredient to get more protein in there, because that's one of the more expensive ingredients.
Yep. Okay.
So one of the things I really appreciated what he taught me in California was about comparative advantage. And he mentioned it in his talk, but he didn't go into any detail on it. Can you talk about what that means and just give an example in the dairy industry of where it might apply to us and how we should think about, where dairies are going to be or how we should advise dairies going forward?
Sure. So there's a reason I didn't talk about it on the webinars, because I had way too much material anyway. But so the concept of comparative advantage is exactly kind of what it sounds. And how I bring it in initially, and it works real well with Philip since he's from Iowa, is I said, how much wheat is grown in the state of Iowa? And the answer is none. Basically none, right? Does that mean you can't produce wheat in Iowa? Absolutely not. I bet you Iowa can produce wheat just about as good as Kansas, but they can produce corn a whole lot better, right? So they might have an absolute advantage for wheat, but their true comparative advantage is corn. So use your resources in the best way possible. And where we've really seen that in the state of California in the dairy industry is there's a lot of corn silage ground that's not in corn silage anymore. Why not? Where did it go, Jim?
Trees.
It went to trees. Not that you can't produce really good corn silage out there with irrigation, but economically, it makes way more sense to grow something else. So even though California might be a tremendous dairy state, to the extent that water is better used on trees, at some point, they lose their comparative advantage for dairy, and that dairy could go somewhere else. So it's just all relative to where something could be done better. So California might have some of the best place to produce dairy, but if they've got better use for those resources, that dairy should go somewhere else. Now, and we've seen that to a small extent, and I suspect over the next 10, 20 years we'll see it more. Then you throw in further complications of government compliance, environmental regulations, labor. That comparative advantage California has had for dairy is slowly going to probably be, moving somewhere else.
In the short term, it really looks like not that dairy's going to come roaring back in California, but the tree guys aren't nearly as happy as they were 3-4 years ago. So just the price, and I don't want to get into too much because I can't I don't know the details, but apparently for years, nobody in the world, the climate is too good. It's perfect for almonds and walnuts, et cetera, in California. They can't grow anywhere else. Well, apparently some other geography has figured out how, yes, they can grow almonds. So the competitive advantage has been lost.
Yep.
And,
makes sense.
Just the economic supply and demand.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, makes sense. I'm kind of curious, Kevin, you were talking about competitive advantage, and is there a geography today that has an advantage over the others where those dairies are going to move to?
Well, yeah. There's another economic concept that was on that same slide that I didn't also talk about, and that's revealed preference. So in economics, when we talk about revealed preference, what we're really saying is what the market's doing on average is probably right. Now, there's individuals within a market that are making dumb decisions every day, but the market as a whole generally is probably correct. So all we have to do is look at what's been going on with cow numbers in the U.S., and I think you can start having your answer there. Michigan, South Dakota, we've got a number of states that have been growing. So that says that's kind of where that advantage is moving to, or else it wouldn't happen, right? Because the market on whole or on average is intelligent, and the fact that we're seeing more cows in certain states says that's not. There's reasons for that.
Okay.
Unfortunately, in my perspective, others might argue with me. What's going to drive it more and more in the future will probably continue to be environmental regulations and labor regulations. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, things that aren't necessarily related to producing milk and the cost of feed. It's going to be more government intervention that either helps us or hurts us. And that's the reality of the market. But it'll be a little less economic driven by true things we think about for making milk and more regulations and policy and things like that.
Okay. All right. Well, gentlemen, I think we're going to wrap her up here. I'd like to leave with just, one comment from each of you, whether that's a key learning from the webinar, the discussion today, whether it's advice for dairy farmers, nutritionists. I'll leave it up to you guys. What would be your final words? And Phil, I'm going to start with you if you don't mind.
Tonight's last call question is brought to you by NitroSure Precision Release Nitrogen. NitroSure delivers a complete TMR for the rumen microbiome, helping you feed the microbes that feed your cows. To learn more about maximizing microbial protein output while reducing your carbon footprint, visit balchem.com/NitroSure.
All right. Well, I'm going to take a lesson I learned from Kevin a long time ago and reiterate in this in his webinar was on the not looking at the feed price or the cost per cow per day, but looking at the income per cow per day. Income over feed costs, I think, is one of the best ways to look at whether a particular cow is going to be profitable. And look and keeping the units on the price on the denominator being the unit of stuff you're making, not the unit of stuff you're putting in. If you're making furniture, it's not it's the profit per chair. It's not the profit per log that's going in. So,
yeah, makes sense. Jim, what comments and wisdom do you have for us?
You didn't have to throw in the wisdom part to that. Something, again, similar to what Philip said in relation to listening to Dr. Dhuyvetter, others that were at the Discover conference and stuff in the fall on longevity. I think this may sound, hopefully I won't have to explain it. I think the importance of well thought out decisions for the dairies is becoming more and more important. It's not, well, should I cull this cow? It's a lot deeper than that. Whether it is a cow val, it's the importance of understanding the impact of decision that gets made. For a long time, we've done it with tractor purchases or whatever, but I just think the depth that somebody needs to have of knowledge and stuff on the making those important decisions is going to be a driver for success on dairies.
Yeah, well said, Jim. Dr. Dhuyvetter, final word.
Okay, so I definitely want to just concur with what Jim just said, is that the days of being very successful with a lot of just gut feel decisions, I think are kind of behind us. There's just so much data and analytics now. We have to make decisions based on the best information we can have. So I guess what I would challenge people to think about is really know your KPIs, know what makes your business successful or not, and constantly strive to get better. Don't worry about what the neighbor's doing. Granted, you're competing with the neighbor potentially, but know where you're at and constantly strive for improvement, because I think the dairy industry will continue to consolidate, will continue to improve. Don't look for the markets to bail you out. Well, we could be successful if we just had $25 milk. Don't, control what you can control.
Yeah, perfect. Great way to end it. Gentlemen, this has been a lot of fun. I've appreciated this. Really enjoyed it. A great way to spend a Friday afternoon. So, Kevin, thank you for joining us and inviting Phil. And Jim, you've been a great co-host. And if you're up for it, I'd like to have you back sometime. So I really like
just give me enough notice, and it'll probably fit. Thank you, Scott. I was honored by the ask.
Oh, no worries. You're quite welcome. So we want to thank everybody. We want to thank our audience, as always, for joining us here at the Real Science Exchange. We hope you learned something. We hope you had fun, and we'll hope to see you next time here at the Real Science Exchange, where it's always happy hour and you're always among friends.
We'd love to hear your comments or ideas for topics and guests. So please reach out via email to anh.marketing@balchem.com with any suggestions, and we'll work hard to add them to the schedule. Don't forget to leave a 5-star rating on your way out. You can request your Real Science Exchange t-shirt in just a few easy steps. Just like or subscribe to the Real Science Exchange and send us a screenshot along with your address and t-shirt size to anh.marketing@balchem.com. Balchem's Real Science Lecture Series of webinars continues with ruminant-focused topics on the first Tuesday of every month, monogastric-focused topics on the second Tuesday of each month, and quarterly topics for the companion animal segment. Visit balchem.com/realscience to see the latest schedule and to register for upcoming webinars.